Well, I think the pandemic did a number of things. It made us aware that when governments wanted to spend money, they can. That was really important. All sorts of other issues where in the past they said, oh, we can't afford it. Suddenly, during the pandemic, they could afford enormous sums of money paid out for furlough and so on. I think also it made people more aware than they had been of health inequalities.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. Richard, thank you so much for joining me on The No Show. I'm really pleased to have you.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I'm really interested in this idea of, in anybody that looks at inequality, regardless of sort of which lens you're looking at inequality from, partly because the No Show podcast was set up to tackle inequality in higher education and sort of the dissemination of research and who accesses it. Now, I know you've been looking at inequality for quite some time. So before we get into sort of, your story and your research, what do you sort of determine or define as inequality?
We looked at income differences, but ideally we would have also had data on wealth differences, but unfortunately they're available on a comparable basis for many fewer countries. But ideally, I think I would have taken some weighted mix of income and wealth differences. I think they're both important.
And so when you look at inequality sort of from a health standpoint or its relationship to health, where was your sort of starting point for the spirit level? What drove that research?
Well, I was one of the first people trained in epidemiology who had not done medicine first. I came into epidemiology from the social sciences, particularly from economic history. In economic history in previous centuries, you often use changes in death rates as an indication of changes in living standards. So it was natural for me to look at relationships between income and death rates. I looked in different occupations as they moved up or down the earnings league over time, and I could relate that to death rates. And then I began to wonder whether more equal societies had lower overall death rates, and I found that was truer than I ever imagined.
And this is as a direct, your research shows that it's as a direct result of the inequality, or are there any issues that inequality causes that leads to these things?
I'm not sure I understand.
So when you're looking at sort of, you said you started by looking at death rates. Were you just looking at death rates in general, or were there sort of like specific areas that you were looking at, for example, obesity or different types of causes of death?
Well, a joke that epidemiologists always make is that doctors are not very good at determining causes of illness, disease, or deaths, but they are good at telling whether people are dead or alive. So the tendency is always to think that overall death rates are pretty reliable, but what is a death from a heart disease or some completely different condition is less reliable.
Mm-hmm.
So always the tendency is to use age-specific death rates.
Mm-hmm.
So we're concerned with how many people in each age group die each year.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, one of your findings, or it's one of the sort of famous takeaways from your research is the fact that a society like the US that is amongst the Western developed countries has one of the lowest life expectancies. Now, having sort of said that, are there any, is that seen as something that the US government should be embarrassed about, or are they actively trying to change it, or is it just, business as usual?
I think most Americans are completely unaware how badly they do compared to other rich countries.
Mm-hmm.
I have a friend who used to teach first-year medical students, and he used to get them to write an essay at the beginning of the course on why they thought America had the best health in the world. And as they did the research for their essay, they gradually found how far from the truth that was.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's true of first-year medical students, I'm sure it's true of Americans more generally. They don't realize that they spend twice as much on medical care as other rich nations and have much lower life expectancy.
I mean, when it comes to these sort of really compelling findings, is it an indictment to capitalism ultimately?
I used to think that the inequalities in health between upper and lower classes, rich and poor, were too deep in our societies for governments to be able to change them. I thought if governments did anything radical enough really to change those health inequalities, they'd be chucked out of office, rather like some of the more left-wing governments in different countries have been. But gradually we began to see that these health inequalities were smaller in some countries than others, and they changed over time. So they were smaller in Britain before Margaret Thatcher's period as Prime Minister in the 1980s. And so we began to see that they were amenable to policy. And so I think that governments can make substantial differences. I don't know how far that can really go, but whether or not capitalism can transform our societies, or whether we will eventually have to get rid of capitalism, I think depends more on how it impacts on the climate crisis. I think that is even more important.
I know you tweet quite a bit about the climate crisis and sort of, the need for us to not think about this, concept of like the 2050 plan and the 2030 plan, and we need to treat it as an emergency. So
I lost you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Froze for a moment. Can you repeat the point?
So one of the tweets I saw you tweet was regarding us thinking about the climate crisis as a 2050 plan and a 2030 plan, and we're not thinking of it as an emergency as you point out it should be. So do you think this is just do you think this is a philosophy of looking at our problems, whether it's a health problem, whether it's a climate problem? It's just a philosophy of just like delaying it for later on?
I don't think it's a philosophy. I think it's that politicians are afraid of doing anything that would change our societies enough to deal with the crisis. Our dependency on high levels of consumption, on fossil fuels and air travel and so on. I don't think it would be at all easy for governments to seriously limit those things and remain in office. And I think that politicians know and fear that. Mm-hmm. And their response actually is simply not to want they want not to believe the evidence. They hope it's not true that the climate crisis is as serious as it seems to be.
So ultimately, then fundamentally it's a money problem. The money is not incentivized. The people who own the capital and run industries and I suppose essentially the inner workings of capitalism, they're not incentivized to change much. Now, whether that's in relation to health or whether it's in relation to climate, are there any ways that money can become sort of incentivized to counter these problems, or is it still just ultimately down to them?
I think that political demonstrations are important. There are several papers which actually show evidence that non-violent demonstrations do really affect public opinion. Mm-hmm. I think if governments feel that public opinion is shifting dramatically, it puts pressure on them to make policy changes.
So, in that regard, I mean, changing sort of public opinion, how much does something like a pandemic, for example, like COVID, how much does that contribute to the awareness of people about problems related to health or our health system or these inequalities? Do you think the pandemic exposes that, or do you think it's just ultimately it's down to the politicians to make the difference?
Well, I think the pandemic did a number of things. It made us aware that when governments wanted to spend money, they can. That was really important. All sorts of other issues where in the past they said, oh, we can't afford it. Suddenly, during the pandemic, they could afford enormous sums of money paid out for furlough and so on. I think also it made people more aware than they had been of health inequalities. Mm-hmm. How huge the differences were, 2- or 3-fold differences in death rates between rich and poor, between different ethnic groups. And I think people were often shocked. I had thought over the 40 years or so of my career that that was one lesson we had really got across to public opinion, that there were these huge differences in life expectancy, which I regard as the biggest human rights injustice in the rich, developed societies. But I think COVID drove that message home further. I think it also made us aware that we are a society, we do affect each other. Thatcher's statement that there is no such thing as society, it made it so clear. It's nonsense. Mm-hmm. If I make myself vulnerable to disease, to the pandemic, then I make everyone I meet more
Exactly.
vulnerable to it. We are all in it together.
It's very interesting, talking about the pandemic, and you rightly pointed out that all of a sudden there was this money tree that politicians mythically talk about. But one of the interesting things for me is I'm not sure if you've come across The Great Leveler, sort of a history of economics book that talks about sort of
Yes.
the sort of leveling the playing field in inequality, and one of the key things that the author points to is that a pandemic typically creates it acts as an equalizer into society and to inequality. Now, having seen what I've seen from sort of COVID, I can't help but think the opposite has happened, because there are groups of people that have become incredibly wealthy as a result of the pandemic.
Yes, there's no doubt that the pandemic has increased inequalities of income and wealth. The super rich have gained enormous sums. Middle class who are able to work at home haven't done too badly. But people doing manual jobs who couldn't work at home, essential workers, people working in supermarkets and so on, were exposed more to disease, but many of them lost their jobs. I remember a carpenter telling me that he couldn't work from home because he hadn't got a 6-mile long screwdriver.
And then I think also on that same note, like we see all these government contracts that were distributed, and and again it speaks to the fact that government and money are so intertwined, and the fact that these people who have certain affiliations with members of the government, and David Cameron famously lobbying for this person and that person to get X amount of money, where the average person was left without support. Does that speak to the fact that the abuse in a pandemic is what causes the problem and not the pandemic itself?
I think that with more inequality, the desire for preeminence, to look good, the importance of money increases.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a study of what's called self-enhancement, showing that in more unequal countries, people big themselves up more, go in for sort of self-advertisement, self-aggrandizement. And I think a great many politicians have gone into politics simply as a form of self-aggrandizement. They don't have genuine knowledge, interest, understanding, commitment to making our society a better place. Basically, they're in politics because of the desire for self-importance.
And that sort of leads us really well to the inner level, which is your more recent book, and it sort of follows on from the spirit level. And now the inner level talks more of the psychological aspect, and sort of following on from what you just described, where there's people have this need for status. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, as I said, there's a study that shows that in all income groups, people are more worried about how they're seen and judged. What's called status anxiety goes up. But there seem to be two responses to that worry about how others judge you. One is that you find social gatherings, social relations increasingly stressful. You withdraw from social life, feeling you're no good, you have low self-esteem, lack of confidence, and so on. So you avoid social meetings and very likely become vulnerable to depression. You don't go out, you don't meet friends. The other response is the opposite. If you're worried about whether people think you're, I don't know, stupid, a failure, boring, you try and big yourself up. You find ways of exaggerating your abilities and achievements. You bring them into conversation when you can. So you find ways of mentioning in conversation that you went to a very good university, or you got promoted very, very young, or whatever it is. You can see those processes are more important, more common in more unequal societies. But as I say, also the consumerism, corruption, the importance of money all increase with inequality. Because it means we judge each other more by rank and social position. And with that, we worry more about how we are judged. And the anxieties we can all have in social meetings, do they think I'm boring, stupid, unattractive? All those increase. And you find, particularly amongst young men and women, they're acutely, those kinds of feelings are acutely important. We've also seen how important they are in terms of reactions to prejudice over race or gender or different sexualities and so on. Any indication that my group is looked down on, nobody wants to tolerate those limitations of self-worth or whatever. And of course, the only way of dealing with that is to reduce inequality. Being poor feels no better if you know that there are equal numbers of men and women, black and white, gay and straight at the bottom. We must have less poverty. We must have smaller income differences. The bigger and more apparent those income differences are, the more we will look down on people at the bottom, imagine they're stupid, failures, incapable, and look up to the people at the top, thinking that somehow they're better than the rest of us.
So, there's this presence of hierarchies in these unequal societies. And now you described that a lot of these sort of young people who might feel a sense of insecurity as a result of being looked down on. What are the typical responses from the research that you've done? What are the typical responses that these young people, these groups of people resort to change the way they're looked at?
Well, I've said that some withdraw from social life and become depressed, sometimes suicidal or self-harm. Rates of self-harm are appallingly high in Britain, for instance, but others try and make themselves look good and exaggerate their abilities and achievements. But
I mean, I'm asking
something else.
I'm asking because I want to see if this has any link to sort of crime, and if crime is a factor that people their need to sort of present themselves in a better way leads them to go into crime to get some quick money or what have you.
Well, there are quite powerful relationships between the proportion of the population imprisoned and inequality. But that is primarily due to more punitive sentencing in more unequal societies. There is evidence that dishonesty goes up in more unequal societies, and a great deal of evidence that violence becomes more common. And that's because violence is triggered by people feeling looked down on, disrespected, humiliated, loss of face. You know, if I can't get you to respect me any other way, I'll do it physically.
Mm-hmm. I find this very, very interesting because, I mean, I'm seeing all sorts of connections right now, but one of the connections, it relates to the work of Professor Robin Murray, who I interviewed a little while ago, and who talks about this insecurity, and how it relates to health and how it relates to sort of stunting amongst young children in certain societies. Now, when we piece all these all these pieces of the puzzle together, what we can see is that there is undeniable evidence that inequality causes all of these problems. And, you know, there's no lack of awareness in government. Now, knowing that government has failed and historically, you know, and continues to fail in challenging inequality, are there any other things that as a society we can do to sort of tackle this?
I think that people being active together is important. I think a feeling of self-efficacy, you know, if you can take political action with others in your community and start to feel you're really making a difference, that is a powerful, it powerfully offsets that sense of worthlessness, of powerlessness, of isolation. You sometimes in the past saw that in strikes of workers, that if instead of just going home and staying home separately, if during the strike they actually came together, you got a strong sense of unity and self-efficacy and so on, of being active with other like-minded people. I think that's extraordinarily important.
So tell me a bit more about the Equality Trust that you set up.
People often asked me when I said it was to campaign on great inequality, well, they would ask me whether it was a campaigning organization or an educational organization. And I used to answer that it campaigns through education. But actually, I have very little to do with it now because I'm no longer on the board and I don't work for it. It's an autonomous charity. So it's had a director who's put her own emphasis on policy. And I suspect we're going to have a new director in the near future, and that might involve further changes. I think, though, that the fundamental perception that drives the Equality Trust has been the empirical research that we've done and published in the two books we've talked about.
And you, so far since you, I mean, you mentioned that you're no longer on it, but when you were on it and sort of when you were sort of setting it up, was the drive to tackle inequality? I mean, you talk about there's an emphasis now on policy, but prior to that, was it to get sort of younger people aware? Was there a particular demographic you focused on, or was it just broadly, you know, talking about inequality?
It was initially almost exclusively occupied with the scale of material differences between rich and poor. It's been more dependent recently on project finance from different funding bodies. So it's done work on things that funders have been interested in, which are more to do with particular sectional inequalities, whether black and white or men and women. My view is that when anything becomes a marker of low social status, it may be skin color, it may be the linguistic group in some societies you belong to, or your religious affiliation, when any of those start to be associated with low social status, they attract the same kind of stigmatization. Human beings have this awful way of using external worth, external wealth as an indication of internal personal worth. And that's why we really have to reduce those material inequalities.
What advice would you give to young academics or people that are interested in looking at inequality and sort of building on what the work that you've started? What advice would you give them?
Well, one of the things I think that happens in research is everything has to be re-established with every generation of researchers in every country. So Americans will never take research that's done in other countries as if it was valid. They have to look at everything themselves, and I think that's true in many countries, but also each generation has to redo the research so that 2 or 3 generations have now gone through the process of showing that unemployment is damaging to health, as if the previous generation of researchers hadn't done that. And so I think there's a continual process of showing the strength of the evidence behind these processes, the damage it does to us all. When I say the damage it does to us all, people often imagine that inequality affects just the poor. It affects the poor most, but even well-off, middle-class, well-educated people with good jobs do better in more equal societies. They'd be likely to live a bit longer. Their children would likely do a bit better at school. They'd be less likely to be victims of violence. In that sense, we all do better in more equal societies.
Absolutely, and I think that's a fantastic point. Now, finally, I want to ask you, I mean, having spent a career looking at this tough subject, I'd say, are you optimistic or pessimistic for the future?
I have become recently extraordinarily pessimistic about the possibilities of tackling climate change. I mean that we've already got to 1.5 degrees rise in temperature, world temperatures, and we've had terrible floods and fires and rises in sea level. And the very best that they hope for is we'll be able to stop the rise getting to 1.5 degrees. But almost nobody thinks that actually we'll manage to stop it going at least to 2 degrees. And the way we're going now, it'll be more like 4 degrees by the end of the century. And that is absolute calamity. People have got used to thinking 1.5 degrees is okay. It's not. There are already hundreds of thousands of people being killed, particularly in poorer countries, by climate change. Droughts so that their agriculture packs up, or floods, or fires and heat waves, all sorts of problems, leading to big flows of refugees and so on, who the rich world is increasingly reluctant to take resists taking them. I think that all these problems would be much easier in a more equal society. I think that, as you saw in France, when President Macron tried to put up the price of fuel as a green policy, and the response was immediately the Gilets Jaunes movement saying it's all unfair, and months of demonstrations in cities all over France, although this policy was still at that stage just a proposal. And Macron eventually dropped it. In the Second World War in Britain, historians of war and social policy say that our government felt that in order to get public participation in the war effort, they had to make the burden of war seem equally shared. And they did that by enormous reductions in income differences, reducing the social hierarchy, having rationing so everyone had the same food rations, but it also extended to clothing and so on. And I suspect that almost any serious policies to tackle climate change in most countries now will be opposed publicly. And I think it'll take an enormous increase in inequality, in equality, before people say, okay, we are in it together. We must do something about this. The analogy with the war effort, I think, is really important.
Where can people find you online?
Where can people find what?
Where can people find you online?
Well, I'm an old man. I'm 78. I'm almost retired. I spend more time growing vegetables than doing other kinds of work. But I do tweet. I use email. My email is richard@richardwilkinson.net.
We'll link your Twitter handle in there anyway, so people can follow you on Twitter and engage with your tweets. But Richard, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I'm privileged to have had the chance to speak to you. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for doing this. I think it's important work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram @TheNoShowPod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.